I will say that being in the federal contracting community, the beauty about what it is that we do, for the most part, really wasn't affected by COVID as the rest of the commercial world is, right? Our customer is the federal government. And for the most part, a lot of folks were still able to continue to work, with the exception of those who were, say, in a SCIF in the Intel community. Even if you look at the federal legislation that was passed with the CARES Act, Section 3610 allowed for many federal contractors to be able to continue billing for work even if they weren't able to continue working. So I would say coming from the federal contracting community, we're actually very blessed given the rest of the world as it pertains to being hit by COVID. I would say from our perspective, a lot of procurements initially when COVID hit were pushed to the right. Thankfully, what we've seen over the last few months as the fiscal year end was culminating was that a lot of the regular procurements started dropping. So they were a little bit delayed, but they ultimately ended up happening. Obviously, PPE, as you mentioned, Alice, that was a big driver for a lot of the flurry at fiscal year end. So the government obviously is buying through DLA or VA a lot of PPE, from gowns to masks to hand sanitizers, you name it. One thing I would say, this definitely exposes issues within the supply chain, as we've been having a national conversation about this. Just a side word of caution, if you've never sold PPE before, I don't recommend it as an industry to jump into just right now, because that was one trend we did see over the last few months, is folks who maybe have had experience in consulting or program management or acquisition support all of a sudden decided that they could also sell PPE, which in itself is its own animal. I think we have seen a second wave of the PPE buying. It initially hit in the early months of COVID, and we've seen a second wave of it, as has been evidenced by some contracts that were awarded over the last, call it 30 days by DoD. So I think going into 2021 and in this next fiscal year, there's going to continue to be that buying. There's still a lot of types of work, though, that will get affected. I know of federal contractors who do, say, event planning, as an example. Well, events have been decimated, so they're not able to host events anymore. But by and large, a lot of folks working for the federal government, it's a good thing they've been able to continue to trudge ahead and continue to provide their products and services.
So I largely agree with everything Katie said. I think that COVID, it's like any other crisis, and this is not meant in a crass way, any other crisis just don't affect the government the way they do the general economy, because the government has to keep functioning. And sometimes it results in a massive increase in infusion of cash into the system. I tend to look at it from a little bit different perspective. I think that the impacts on the industry have really been on those who are part of the sort of the major system supply chain, those who are second, third, fourth, fifth tier suppliers to large defense contractors that are, sorry about that, that are large defense contractors that are manufacturing equipment for the military and so forth, where factories literally had to close down and supply chains were dramatically interrupted. So a lot of the 3610 money that Katie's talking about will go to make up the losses over there, as opposed to the probably 60 or 70% of other dollars that the government spends on services and technology and sort of commodity products that we're continuing to flow through the system. We'll come back maybe at another time and talk a little bit more about Katie's comment about PPE and not jumping in. What we've seen in every crisis, every emergency since I've been around is the trend, exactly what Katie talked about, people without proper experience trying to jump into the game, but also frankly some fly-by-night outfits that get into the game that get contracts, the contracts blow up, and then the entire system takes the hit. And so, I think we're always on guard against the difference between an emergency situation where the normal rules can't apply and a more sustainment situation where you can get back to some degree of normalcy and follow those processes. In terms of trends for this year, I've had a lot of trouble putting my finger on any specific trend, and I think I finally concluded it's the obvious. It's because of COVID. It's basically been a year in which the government's just trying to get the job done. I think that there will be some long-term impacts that'll have a peripheral or an ancillary effect on procurement when we get back to figuring out what the future of work looks like, what the future of the workplace looks like. That'll get into a lot of issues around personnel management, workplace environments, where they're going to work. Obviously, a very large percentage of government contractor employees work on site with the customer. And as Katie pointed out, a lot of the customers couldn't get their sites, but most of them were able to figure out a telework policy, which frankly is an enormous shift for the government. I'll just go back to Hurricane Katrina, when President Bush went on television and told everybody, telework, 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 everybody down in the Gulf. And most of the companies that we represented that were in the Gulf were told by their contracting officers, no, we're not going to let you telework. If we can't see your body in the office, we're not going to pay you. This time around, none of that happened. I mean, I don't think I've heard a single case where there was a dispute over whether a company could telework or not. So I think that we are seeing an acceptance, even in the intelligence community, more and more of a distributed workforce. And that will have a clear effect on pricing and staffing and so forth going forward.